Kia ora koutou, Morena. Thank you all for joining us here this morning for this COP30 debrief and dialogue with key insights from Belém for New Zealand businesses. And looking at the registrations and the numbers that are coming in this morning, what an amazing turnout. It's such a pleasure to have the opportunity here to host you, given this keen interest in COP and the insights from the action in Belém. I just want to start with a huge thanks to our friends at the Centre for Sustainable Finance, who we've partnered with for this event. Jo Kelly and her team do a fantastic job leading out on sustainable finance, and it's always a great opportunity to be able to come together and collaborate on important mahi like this. So thank you, Jo, and thank you to the Centre for Sustainable Finance. I'd also like to thank our guest speakers who are going to be joining us here today, who are going to share their perspectives and valuable insights. So we've got Stuart Horne, who's the New Zealand Climate Change Ambassador. We've got Sean Kidney, the CEO of Climate Bonds Initiative, and we've got Dr. Belinda Mathers, the Chief Scientist for Toitū Envirocare. Stuart and Belinda have not long landed back in New Zealand on New Zealand soil, so this is all very fresh for them, while Sean is beaming into us from Japan today. So thank you for navigating the time zones today, Sean, and the jet lag to be here. We're going to have some opportunity for Q&A at the end of the session. I'm sure many of you have got some questions, so please feel free to submit any questions that you have using the usual Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we'll do our best to get through as many of those as we can. I can't promise we'll get through all of them, just given the sheer volume of people we've got on today, but we will do our best. So look, in many ways, COP30 represented a milestone moment. It was 10 years since the Paris Agreement was signed. We've seen continued global signals for the transition with an ambition to mobilise $1.3 trillion annually for climate change by 2035, and a tripling of adaptation finance, which is critical for supply chains, risk management, and particularly to developing countries. We also saw announcements of a new mechanism and new innovations, like the Tropical Forests Forever innovation, aiming to shape future trade and investment. But despite these promising headlines, this COP was certainly not without its critics. The final agreement text had no mention of fossil fuels, with many commentators saying the summit was one of the most divisive in its 3 decades of meetings. And it provided a reality check on just how much global consensus has broken down on certain areas about what we have to do about climate change. So what was it like for those on the ground, and what did they see and what did they hear? And we're really interested in those reflections, both about COP30, but also about what comes next. So today I want to start off with the government perspective on this by asking our New Zealand Climate Change Ambassador, Stuart Horne, to begin with his reflections and insights on what he saw. Over to you, Stu.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Just checking you can hear me?
We can.
Good. Well, kia ora tātou. It's nice to be back in New Zealand after a very long flight from Belém. Nice to see you, Belinda. Belinda and I caught up while we were there. So yes, it is a long way for close to 50,000 people to travel to the edge of the Amazon to have a meeting on climate change. And as Mike said, you know, the Belém political package I describe as the good. You know, there's good bits, there's bad bits, there's underwhelming bits, and you know, I had a nice summary of the outcomes, but I think Mike has in many ways covered those off quite majorly. But equally, I think the point you're making was it was divisive. But at the same point, it was 194 members coming together, committed to climate change and making clear that they still had the focus on the 1.5 degrees. There was still a focus on adaptation, climate adaptation, a focus on climate finance, and that ability that a COP has to encourage people. You know, frankly, would as many countries have submitted nationally determined contributions if there wasn't a COP to have that moment, that ratcheting effect you get? If you remember when New Zealand submitted its nationally determined contribution back in early January, just in front of the deadline, we were the 8th country in the world to have submitted it. Just before COP, only 70 had submitted. So there is an important ratcheting effect. There's an important pressure on countries. So I think, in fairness, this was framed as an implementation COP. So big, sweeping, transformative outcomes were never that likely. You know, at the end of the day, every year you can't just get big, you know, big outcomes, big results. You know, that's just not actually viable. You know, last year was the national quantified goal, NCQG, that was a big outcome, big numbers. The challenge this year was, how do you get that focus on adaptation? For New Zealand, that wasn't hard. 60% of our climate finance is on adaptation already. So we're in a good space. It makes it actually quite hard from a New Zealand perspective to triple that because we're already at 60%. But overall, I think we're in many ways ahead of that particular goal. So I think that's been quite interesting. Just checking, Mike, is this on the record or off the record?
Today, you're speaking to a very broad audience, so I would probably keep it on the record.
Okay, good. So, look, I think, speaking honestly, there was some disquiet at the conclusion of the plenary. There was definitely a range of countries that voiced objections to the package, but I think the Brazilian presidency did what it could to conclude, a package that managed to bring together as many differing views as possible. I think the other issue that was of interest to New Zealand was what would happen in terms of COP31. As most people listening to this will know, New Zealand had strongly supported Australia hosting COP31 in Adelaide and bringing a Pacific focus to that and taking the opportunity to have a COP in this part of the world to highlight the existential threat that many Pacific Island countries face as a result of climate change. As others will have seen, that wasn't where things landed, and COP31 will be held in Antalya. However, as part of that negotiations, there was an agreement that a pre-COP meeting will be held in the Pacific. There will be a funding proposal on the Pacific Resilience Facility that will come as will also be will be prioritised. There will also be an increasing focus on Pacific issues at the COP that both Turkey and Australia agreed to. So from our perspective, maybe not the ideal outcome, but Australia worked really hard to ensure that its priority, which was how do we actually make sure that there is a focus on Pacific issues at the COP. As people have seen, while Turkey is the COP president, Australia is the president of COP negotiations. I could spend a lot of time trying to explain exactly what that means. There is a written agreement between Turkey and Australia and what that looks like, but essentially Australia will be running the negotiations process, and that will include picking facilitators, drafting texts, doing a range of the processes that you just saw the Brazilians do. So there is quite a significant Australian element there. So, I mean, the other important part of COP, I suppose, is the bilateral element. So, from Minister Watts's perspective, en route to COP, he went to Sao Paulo, supported a range of New Zealand tech businesses, including in the sustainability space, but not exclusively at an NZT event. And then, as well as delivering his national statement, I think the minister ended up with 12 bilateral meetings. He signed a clean energy partnership with the UK. He signed a geothermal arrangement with Iceland, and a letter of intent to cooperate on climate change with Indonesia. So quite a lot of good conversations, good meetings with Singapore, Japan, the UK, EU, a range of discussions on climate change. That's a focus not just on the negotiations, but just, areas for New Zealand to cooperate, including in the tech space. The one issue that didn't get anywhere from a business perspective was obviously trade and climate, which has essentially been pushed out till next year. And obviously a lot of that issue is around carbon border adjustment measures and concerns from some countries, the unilateral measures, and other countries saying, well, this is an important way to ensure that our business can remain sustainable, literally sustainable. So that was an interesting outcome as well, but it didn't obviously make that forward. Obviously, the roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels did not achieve consensus either. Yep, Mike, I think it's fair to say it wasn't as an ambitious outcome as many would have wanted, but at the same point, it was also a reflection of the situation, I suppose, the globe's finding itself in, with one obviously major former party not there. And I'll say no more on that. because I'm the government rep on the record. So I think that's for me is the take. I mean, it was, you know, it was an interesting place to have a COP because, you know, it is a long way away. There was obviously a focus on, rainforest. There was a focus also Indigenous, and that was seen both in terms of some of the discussions, but bluntly also seen in some of the protests at the start as well. So you know, it's I think Brazil will have been relatively happy that they got a conclusion because I think, as Belinda would know, there was points near the end where it wasn't entirely clear that we were actually going to get a conclusion to this thing. So I think that's really positive that something was landed. But was it as ambitious as many would want? I think it's probably fair to say it wasn't. But COPs just aren't about the negotiations. They are an opportunity to strengthen the partnerships for New Zealand as well. And I think we've got to look at that perspective and just the reality that these things are consensus based.
Thanks, Stu. I really appreciate that. And I'm sure we're going to have a lot of Q&A over this, but really good update. Much appreciated. So going from the government side, now looking more on the business side, just like to invite Sean Kidney, who's the CEO of Climate Bonds Initiative, to provide your reflections and insights, and particularly that private sector and investment side. Over to you, Sean.
Sure. COPs are really exciting for anyone who hasn't had a chance to be there because of the partnership side, because of this incredible best of science. If you want to get a quick update of everything that's going on in the world in this area, which is, a rough area, a COP is the place to do it. You wander around the halls, the blue zone and so on, and it's just, it's like a flood of information. I sat in to one panel. I was giving a speech at a event run by the Kuhn Logistics University of Zurich, and the work they've done on maritime futures, how we're going to be able to shift our bulk carrier fleet from coal to other kinds of minerals without necessarily a loss of business of shipping owners, which is really important for my base investors to understand. How we can actually repurpose, which I hadn't realized, repurpose LNG carriers to become ammonia carriers and so on, was amazing. That looks the whole global industry, in the maritime industry, the kinds of fuels that are going to be used. Ammonia around the world is going to be without much doubt anymore, and the kind of investments that are going to need to be made in the next few years. That sort of stuff is like everywhere on tap. So if you're a bit of a person working in the area, like Stuart or like Belinda, it's an extraordinary festival of knowledge and ideas, which is tied to lots and lots of partnership discussions. And I guess that goes to the broader issue about what are we doing here? There's been this idea since I started going to COP in Copenhagen in 2009 that we'd have a compliance regime, that somehow New Zealand would be able to be part of a vote that would make force the USA to do X, Y, and Z, or whatever it might be. It's always been a coalition of the willing. And the Paris Agreement exemplifies it, right? It was a voluntary agreement. The rhetoric of the Paris Agreement, of other agreements, of course, is very important in terms of signalling. And I think what Stuart was alluding to is that there's a gap in rhetoric coming out of this COP compared to what the Brazilians hope to achieve. Absolutely. But on the other hand, the discussions from individual parties and the frameworks that parties can work within. Think of Article 6 and the negotiations that Indonesia is already happening in Japan about carbon credit trading for forest protection and so on. All of these things that flow out of the COP are really substantial and really important measures. So, I think there's a kind of awakening that this COP represented, that really it's about how we work together amongst coalitions of the willings. And that's well and truly underway. And that's the case with investment too. In the world we work in, institutional investors, the likes of NZ Super, the issue of climate is not a question, it's a certainty. Actuaries read climate science. They understand what's going on, and they understand the forward risks, and they are looking for ways to be able to address that forward risk or mitigate that risk going forward. And in that context, the interest is what to do and how to go about it, not whether the US is there. And, I was involved in giving 20 speeches while I was around COP. And in none of the events I was part of was the US mentioned. I mean, slightly bizarre, really, but it just were people just getting on with it. And I think that's another thing that's important to note too. This was a really interesting COP just in terms of culturally, because there were all sorts of people from all sorts of economies and a much stronger without the American presence. I mean, Gavin Newsom did walk past me at one point, so there were Americans there. It's generally the rest of the world was just getting on with it and not worrying too much about the gyrations in the US is the way I look at it. Adaptation and resilience were a big part of the agenda. We're focusing very strongly on that as the next stage of issues because climate change is being breached. We've got to 1.5 and need to repair. That was very much in the agenda. Nature, it's Brazil, of course, was very much in the agenda. We were in Belém. Across the river is the rainforest, which is, glorious and gorgeous. Albeit it's a little hot and there are a few mosquitoes. It's the nature of biodiversity. You get more bugs, etc. It was symbolically important, Belém, because, under current projections of climate change, Belém will probably be underwater in 2050, the whole city, because of the extreme trajectory of change, which is what we're still on at the moment. So I think it was actually incredibly symbolic and useful for Lula to stage the COP there. I was dubious at first. There are some context things I've got to draw attention to in terms of optimism about what's going on. Understand that last year, and I'm an International Energy Agency's Finance Advisory Board, last year, 93% of all investment in electricity generation on the planet was clean energy. Guys, we've won on that. Yeah, there's cleaning up. Yeah, there's a phase-out program. But essentially, on electricity, the game's over. And frankly, that's because of Europe and China state action to grow that for domestic political reasons. Last year in China, 50% of all cars sold were electric. But it wasn't just China. In Ethiopia, it was 60% of all cars sold were electric. In Turkey, it was 26%. In Pakistan, it was 27% of all cars sold were electric. Guys, something major is well and truly underway in another segment of it all. We're about to see this start happening in other sectors like shipping in particular, where the major ports of the world are all now collaborating on shifting towards ammonia fuel feedstocks going forward. So we'll see rapid change in green steel, where we work with Hebei in China, which is the producer of 12% of the world's steel in one province. And they have an iron and steel plan, which is moving China to electric arc furnaces and recycling steel and green hydrogen. This green steel is beginning to become the norm quite quickly, etc., etc., etc. We're in the middle of a global revolution because of actions by individual states and individual geographies in the past, spurred by climate negotiations, but also spurred by domestic considerations, whether it be energy security or whatever it might be. This is the background to COP. It's important to understand that. We're not still starting scratch. We're actually riding a wave of change. And exactly how that plays out is going to be complicated. I guess one of the things we did is we looked at the forward pipeline of investments that are sustainable coming through. In our particular area, we work on sustainable debt. So a report we published showed that amongst just 12 countries, including Japan and the UK and Australia and Brazil, we had $4.4 trillion of sustainable debt coming through the pipeline from creditworthy institutions, and this is pretty definitive. The global figure, by the way, is 17.8 trillion. As this is no longer a rounding area. So this is in the 1.3 trillion bucket of Belém is about new stuff from emerging markets, mainly. That's really what that's about. And there's a lot of areas where there's going to be new stuff coming through. For someone like pension fund or an institutional investor, this is now becoming 15% of the overall market. This is now a major part of, and it's on a growth curve. It's still beginning to grow quite quickly. So from investor perspective, who have been worrying about the impacts of climate change because they've all got actuaries worrying about long-term assets and liabilities matching. We now see an opportunity to be able to allocate funds in a way that meets short-term requirements, Mike, that pays your pension when you retire, and also as a bonus feature, addresses our climate consideration. This is like manna from heaven, because it's solving a short-term and a long-term problem. And we had an event in the pre-COP in Sao Paulo the week before Belém, where at PRI in person, which is a gathering of the world's investors, essentially. And we had investors representing $4 trillion on the stage, and five major governments, Brazil, Japan, Australia, for UK, presenting their climate action plans. And the investors were saying, yes, please give us more of that. We are interested in investing. And the lesson for New Zealand is climate action plans. I'm talking about enabling policy that will create investable opportunities. I'm putting aside the compliance question at the moment, is very much of interest now to global investors. New Zealand's been issuing green bonds in the past. More of those global investors are saying. But above all, tell us where the pipeline of projects is coming through. And next year, we will have a much larger event. We're building on what we've done in COP in this area. And we have investors from all around the world who are saying, give me the pipeline. Show it to me. I want to know. And I want to speak to governments who are encouraging and growing the pipeline. So that's a sort of, let's call that a side piece to the formal negotiations, but not unrelated, critically important. And COP was bringing those people together. So, there's actually a lot of really interesting news around this COP. There are a lot of developments that are critically important. The game in terms of understanding what kind of pipeline and deal flow we need and are going to get in the future is over. Really, it's just a matter now of finding it and digging it up and creating it. Everything from critical minerals to hydrogen, if you can make the numbers work, to sustainable agriculture. It's now just wherever I go around the world talking about, let's package the deal flow and let's get that investment going, because the investment wants to go. In the words of Bertrand Milot, who's the from La Caisse, the second biggest pension fund in Canada, he said, we want climate action plans from governments. We're excited by what we saw from Australia and Japan, and we'd like to see a lot more coming forward. And I think that's the opportunity for New Zealand.
Sean, thank you very much. That's fantastic, and great to see that energy and passion and pragmatism coming through as well. I think too often we get very focused on negotiation and we forget that COPs aren't just about the negotiation. They're about all of those other people who are there making deals, making things happen. And I think we're going to have quite a few questions for you on that coming forward. So thank you again. Just before I pass over to our next speaker, just a reminder, please put your questions into the Q&A here. I'll be feeding those through to the panelists. I've got some questions myself for them, but always good to have questions from the group as well. So we've talked about the business side of things. We've talked about the government side of things. I think now it's time to talk about the science side of things, and I can think of no one better than our next speaker, Dr. Belinda Mathers, who's the Chief Scientist for Toitū Envirocare, and just really interested to hear your reflections and insights. Over to you, Belinda.
Thanks, Mike, and kia ora koutou. Thanks for the opportunity to join the illustrious panel today. It was the third COP I'd been to. Didn't go last year, but I went the two before that. So I was really interested to see what might have changed in the conversations, where things might be going, and whether there were different topics from before, I guess. So overall, it kind of felt similar in some ways. I think things had advanced. I've got a few photos that might help people to kind of get a bit of a sense of what it's like. So I'll share those and hopefully that works. What that has done is make everything else go a bit strange on my screen, but that's all right. So, all right, got my screen sorted, I think. So I guess, it's always busy. There's loads going on. You've got over 100 sort of parallel sessions going on with no central program. So you're always trying to work out what it is I want to go and see today, what, might be interesting in advance, either your thinking, your understanding, or, ability to make connections, whatever the purpose is. And it was hot. It was, we were effectively in the biggest marquee you've ever seen for a couple of weeks. But it was massively stimulating and really interesting to, be thinking about the the changes, the direction, particularly in the context of the geopolitical situation that the whole world's in right now. It's not just the US. There's been lots of changes. There's lots of challenges going on. But there was a real focus on integrity. So from the context of where I come from, Chief Science and Integrity Officer, really good to see lots of conversation about we need good data, we need high integrity information coming out of businesses, because we need to be able to make good decisions, and you can't make good decisions without good information. Whether that be around emissions data, whether it be around high quality carbon credits, where there's been a lot of challenge over the last wee while, reporting, things around transition and adaptation. Integrity was key. Harmonising standards was talked about a lot, or harmonising the way we do things. Companies that want to make decisions, or entities that want to make decisions, want to be able to compare apples with apples. So it's hard to do that if you've got a whole bunch of different standards going on. So there's a big focus on how might we do that better so that we get good information. Talk about value chains or supply chains, both from an emissions reduction perspective, but increasingly from the perspective of adaptation and risk and opportunity. It's not all negative. And how might the big companies in the world, but also the smaller ones, be thinking about their value chains and how they might reduce risk beyond their business as well as within their business, to take advantage of the opportunity that might come from that. As Sean said, there was a lot of conversation about adaptation, about nature, that we can't be thinking about climate without thinking about nature. They're inextricably linked, both in terms of the risks and the benefits. If we've got increasing biodiversity loss, then we get the reduced amount of sequestration from that biodiversity or those forests. And then we get to tipping points sooner if we're not looking after biodiversity and climate together. So there was a lot of talk going on around that, and not just within value chains, but companies like McDonald's were talking about how they're thinking beyond their value chain, because if they're only thinking within their value chain, how do they get new suppliers on board that meet their requirements? So Sean said there was not a whole lot of conversation about the US. There was a little bit that I heard, but there was conversation about the broader sort of change in geopolitical direction that's kind of driving less mandated action, but it's not stopping businesses doing stuff. Businesses are seeing that there's real business benefit from really driving in the right direction. Those from the US that I was talking to are saying there's a whole lot of stuff happening, not being talked about so much, but the term America is all in was heard a few times over the course of the COP. So it's great to have enabling environments created by government, but it's not vital, and work is happening in any case. There was a good amount of conversation, as Sean said, around Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous voices. Some of the protests and those sorts of things were really focusing in that space and making sure that Indigenous wisdom is being recognised and Indigenous voices are being heard in these conversations that could easily, just be corporates talking and government representatives talking, but not thinking really in the detail, not going down to communities and I won't say the coalface, it's not really the right term anymore, but the work happening on the ground and what Indigenous knowledge can add to that. There was a bit of talk about the 1.5 degree, what's happening with 1.5 degrees? Have we already passed it? What's the point in aiming for 1.5 now? And really what the message that was coming through is Yeah, 1.5 degree is a threshold. It shouldn't be thought of as a target. It should be thought of as a threshold. And after we pass that threshold, things get more difficult. Ecosystems get much more badly impacted. Climate change, extreme weather events get much worse. But the fact that 1.5 degrees has been exceeded, over a, short period of time, doesn't mean we're necessarily locked into it as a target by the end of the century. It's going to be really hard to meet that, but every fraction of a degree matters. So every action that anybody can take matters. So that was a theme that I was hearing as well. The types of tipping points that we cross when between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming are really significant. Things like the Greenland ice sheet, West Antarctic ice sheet collapse, coral reefs dying off, northern permafrost thawing really suddenly, which releases a whole lot more carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Sea currents changing, and we're not quite sure what that's going to look like and what the impacts might be, but likely to be really significant. Those are the sorts of things that happen between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So, let's not be going, oh, 1.5's gone, maybe 2's a better target. Let's be aiming for as much as we, as close as we can get to 1.5 degrees. In terms of, there was a bit of conversation around, the value of COPs, and people go to COPs because they think it's worth going to. So I guess that was a little bit of preaching to the converted a little bit, but there was, talk around, do COPs work? Are they doing the job? And a stat that I found interesting was that when the Paris Agreement was adopted, we were looking like 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And now we're looking like more like 2.5 degrees based on current commitments and ambition. 2.5 is too high, but it's definitely far better for the future of mankind and ecosystems as we know it than 4 degrees. So COPs are working. We're not going fast enough. We're not, there's more we can do, but I found it really valuable conversation. The vibe in business was, we're going to do this. We're stubbornly optimistic. There's benefit for business in doing this well. And those are the sorts of things that make it happen. If it felt like, oh, it's just the right thing to do, as soon as things get hard, people stop doing it. But if it's the right thing for business, if it's creating opportunity, if it's reducing risk, then businesses, will continue to take the action.
Thank you, Belinda. As usual, fantastic summary of what you saw and heard there. Loving the photos. So keep those coming through. Well, look, a huge thank you to the panelists so far for your insights. We're already getting a lot of feedback on how positive people are finding that and really useful. So we're now going to turn over to the interesting component. We'll get into the Q&A. I've got one here. I'm going to go straight into some of the questions that are being asked from people. The first one is one for you, Sean, which is, are there any particular types of project that are attracting more interest from investors? So, e.g. clean energy and fuels, new technology development, nature-based solutions and regeneration projects, low emission products, or is there a high appetite and interest across the board?
There's a couple ways of answering that. In the debt space, and I'm working in debt mainly, not so much in equity. Clearly, anything that is broadly in line with climate is working, and this is not just decarbonisation, but is also adaptation resilience. We certified a bond issued by Tokyo Metropolitan Government a couple of weeks ago, which was 7 times oversubscribed, which is a beautiful level of oversubscription, which is quite consistent with decarbonisation related green bond issuance from renewables or electric transport and so on. So I'm going to say, if you're looking for what qualifies, look at taxonomy, look at the work that the CSF is doing on taxonomy to give a clue about the kind of things that will qualify. We don't see much difference in terms of the thematic aspects of that beyond different areas. Of course, there's a financial viability stuff. I mean, clearly stuff's got to be able to work. We've got to be able to make sure we pay your pension, Mike, as well as sort out the long-term issues around climate change. So that's just a given. I'm not going to go in that area. In terms of equity, I mean, yeah, there's some crazy excitement going on. Data centers are booming and so on. Green data centers are one of the areas of focus. So there's lots of equity options coming up. The property developers who are doing these sorts of things with clean energy and water management, et cetera, et cetera. In any kind of frothy market, there will be things that will have more attention than others. And it goes up and down. In the middle of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or of course, oil stocks went to the roof because of the short-term impact on the oil stocks. But I would still say the trajectory of change for investors, long-term trajectory, and I say this when I talk to investors who've got long-term horizons, is very clear. Value is accreting in the energy spaces. Value is accreting in electric vehicle spaces. Value is accreting in green buildings. Rentals in green buildings in New York and London are significantly better than rentals in buildings that aren't classified as green. It's simple. It's a post-COVID feature of the market. And of course, that then flows on to investor appetite for debt issued by those kinds of property trusts or whatever. So we see across the board a bias amongst institutional investors towards sustainable investments. And that's there's a lot of indicators around all that. Does that mean that cleaning up a dairy farm investment in South Island is going to be investment? I don't know, because that's primarily to do with the investability of that. And of course, we need people like Toitū to tell us that it's actually kosher and is probably going to contribute to climate science. So it's a complicated way of answering it. I just do want to say something that Belinda mentioned too, by the way, which I didn't say. I get excited by the opportunities coming through, but I do want to say the news does remain really tough, and we kind of need to keep reminding ourselves in this. As stuff starts happening that is really interesting, and this innovation, incredible innovation coming through in Japan at the moment. I'm speaking to companies that are doing some amazing work on clean manufacturing, etc. We do need to keep reminding ourselves to track the science, and we are still traveling at the worst possible trajectory of climate impacts, and we are dicing of our future in a way we wouldn't if we got into a plane between Wellington and Auckland. With the percentage likely disaster coming, the predictions of potential disaster coming through, we wouldn't get in a car. But we're doing this to the planet. So I just want to mention to everyone that was also part of the discussion. And that is something that is that drives my passion and needs to drive all our passion going forward. It's not just opportunity. It's the fact that we've got this nasty thing biting our bum behind us. And it's still seriously biting our bum.
Thanks, Sean. I think that's a really important point that you make there. I think sometimes when we are focused, particularly in the business side, we're focused on the opportunities, which is great, and it's as we should be doing. But we are facing this, existential threat, and also great to hear, Belinda, your point around the fact that 10 years ago we were facing a 4-degree threat. Now it's more like a 2.5 to 2.8 degree threat, but still a threat nonetheless, and still urgent and still in need of action. So a great reminder there. We've got some really good questions coming through here. So I've got one for Ambassador Horne. In the meetings with key trade partners, was there any pushback on New Zealand's perceived weakening of domestic climate policies and ambitions, e.g. the biogenic methane revision, oil and gas ban repeal, etc.?
Honestly, and I was in all but one of the bilateral meetings with the minister, and we can't go into a lot of detail of what was discussed, but no, we got asked some questions about what was behind it, and the minister explained based on the same messaging he's given in New Zealand. But bluntly, in most meetings, it didn't come up, and in one particular meeting, there was some questions asked, and a couple of meetings there were some questions asked, but more questions rather than pushback.
Interesting, very interesting. Got one here for you. Actually, sorry, one for Belinda. Great, really great lineup and fantastic work, team. I agree. My area is biodiversity finance. Good work, Belinda. The Living Planet Index is now below 30% left from 50 years ago and declining. Climate wins lead to biodiversity wins, and biodiversity wins lead to climate wins. Question: can we get anywhere without a better commitment from business to invest more in biodiversity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there was quite a bit of conversation around sort of mechanisms for that investment and those sorts of things, because there's two elements. There's the willingness to invest in biodiversity from an adaptation perspective or from broader perspective, and then there's the how do we do it piece, and how do we do it with integrity, and how do we know that it's going to have the outcomes that we're looking for. And there's a bit of work still to be done in that space, in areas like carbon credits. Over the last decade, there's been a massive amount of work around frameworks and integrity and how to, all those things. The more pure sort of biodiversity credit space isn't quite there yet. So there's more work to do in that space. I think it's really important that businesses invest in biodiversity, but there needs to be a really great driver for it so that businesses can justify that investment in what is a challenging environment right now. So we need to have ways to be able to connect that biodiversity benefit with the business and their risks and their opportunities. And then that makes the valuing of biodiversity, the valuing of the action and the investment easier to justify, I guess.
Good answer. Thank you for that, Belinda. Here's a general question for all three panelists. Anyone should feel free to answer this one. What did you hear about new tech for reducing biogenic methane emissions?
I'm going to pause, and the answer is not a lot other than the new tech that you're hearing in New Zealand from AgriZero in terms of biogenic methane emissions, more specifically enteric fermentation. My general impression is we are world leading in this space in terms of the work that's been done in genetics, in terms of boluses, in terms of vaccines, all that work that's going on. There really, I mean, I obviously was not at as many side events as others, but certainly in agricultural events that I was at, there wasn't a lot of discussion of new tech other than the sort of examples that bluntly New Zealand was coming up with. That wasn't something that other countries were talking about. Now, I'm not saying they're not doing it, but it certainly wasn't coming up in the meetings I was at anyway.
Thanks, Stu. Sean?
I'm going to say I'm not across the new tech, my team is, but we're focusing on institutions that are driving for change. And last night I had dinner with senior manager of Osaka Gas, one of the biggest gas consumers in the world, and they actually have a really interesting strategy to, as they call it, contribute to a better world. There's a whole methane leakage management side, which is our first and most urgent task in methane, to just stop venting into the atmosphere as we are around the world, and then look at how they can drive supply chains, push their suppliers to have no flaring, no venting policy, leakage monitoring, etc., etc. 3% leakage in the gas system is the same as having coal-fired power plants. It's like a disaster. But more interestingly, this was a major gas institution that was now adopting a whole conversion to biomethane strategy and different kinds of feedstocks. And it was fantastic for us because we're trying to support them with fundraising for all this sort of stuff. But it was just a bit of an exemplar of what's going on in the consumer nations around the world. There's a lot of really interesting thinking about the need to change business models, even in a difficult and persistently difficult area like gas going forward. So that's what I'd report back to people. If you're looking at the energy side, watch this space. There's going to be a lot of very interesting news coming through the next few years.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Belinda, did you want to make a comment on that one?
I was going to say something very similar to what Stu said, to be honest. So nothing further to add.
Okay, well, I've got one specifically for you. It says, thank you for sharing, Belinda. There still seems to be a level of uncertainty around the ongoing relevance of a 1.5 degree pathway. From a governance and reporting perspective, should organisations continue to anchor their scenario analysis to a 1.5 degree scenario, or is it more appropriate to shift towards alternative, orderly transition pathways that may better reflect emerging global trends? Thank you.
Great question. So I guess continuing to use a 1.5 degree pathway as the sort of best case scenario has some benefits, because it does give that ability to be thinking about, what might be possible as a baseline, I guess, against some of the other scenarios that might be considered. So if trying to work out what scenarios to be looking at, a baseline, a sort of midpoint, and a more sort of worst case scenario will give useful information, even if the numbers aren't quite perfect, even if it's 1.7 rather than 1.5, whatever it might be. The context is really useful, I think, around just trying to be comparing what might be possible with what might be more likely if we don't try so hard.
Right, I've got a question here for Stu. COP30 once again failed to secure a fossil fuel phase out. What kinds of signals does this send for the future of multilateral climate negotiations, in your view?
Well, I suppose, yeah, I mean, as you say, there wasn't consensus around the proposals that were there. I suppose I'd get back, though, that there is still a COP28 agreement to transition away from fossil fuels. So, this was adding to that, but that doesn't take away from the fact that there was an agreement at COP28 to transition away from fossil fuels. Look, as I say, this is a consensus organisation, and consensus wasn't able to be reached. The Brazilian presidency's put out a voluntary initiative now, so we'll see what that looks like. It just reflected one of the more difficult sticking points, I suppose, of the negotiation.
Yep. One for Horne. Forest finance was a focus at COP30 following the release of the 2025 State of Finance for Forests report, and the launch of the Forest Finance Roadmap in collaboration with COP30 and Brazil's leadership. The report findings indicate that forests remain significantly underfunded and that forest investments need to triple by 2030, which is only 4.5 years away, to achieve the Rio Convention targets. Did discussions on this topic at COP30 extend to the New Zealand context? And what do you see as the opportunities and constraints for New Zealand around forest finance?
Look, I'm going to have to leave the New Zealand angle to Stuart, who I'm sure will have some insights in there, given the importance of forests in the whole New Zealand landscape. I'm going to say globally, clearly forests are on the agenda. I mean, we're in Belém, for God's sake. You can, and in Brazil, it's all about avoid deforestation. Pathways through this, it's challenging in terms of the broader conversations outside the formal negotiation process. Well, not entirely. I mean, I'm going to say the Article 6 agreements between countries that are coming through are critically important to forest retention. I'm looking forward to Sumatran palm oil farmers deciding to abandon their palm oil plantations and reforest because of the funding they're getting from the forthcoming Japanese carbon market, which is starting up in about 12 months, for example. There's a lot of interesting developments that are coming through there. One notable proposal was the Tropical Forest Facility, which was a $100 billion investment facility that was floated by the Brazilian government. It was originally actually a proposal of the World Bank Treasurer Ken Lay about 15 years ago, but it's resurfaced now. It's an interesting idea, and there was some progress made in that, but also some setbacks. For people that don't know, the idea is to set up a large bond trading fund, $100 billion fund, which would have an arbitrage between large-scale diversified portfolio and the interest rates to be preferential interest rates to be made in emerging markets, higher interest rates and more risk, but spreading that risk across a whole lot of countries. It would be 80% invested in emerging markets, 20% in rich countries, and so on. There's a whole risk story of how they got there. It's a very interesting exercise and look very positive. Large chunk of the coupon, the interest rates, would then go directly to forest nations. So in other words, when you create a fund, you'd invest in bonds, and then you'd have some coupon sacrifice That is, you wouldn't send all the money back to the people put the money in, which would be dominated by rich country investors. You would send some back to Gabon or the Congo or Brazil. Um, Brazil started off thinking it had the cornerstone investments from rich countries, but we had a fallback from the UK who had to pull out because of domestic budget issues. So I think we're currently down to about 10 billion of the 20 billion putting into it. So they've got a bit of work to do. But the project is still alive. One development, which I think is important, we had something to do with, is the universe of investment. So the consultants were telling us, well, you're going to have to invest in anything to be able to get the arbitrage, including oil and gas bonds if necessary, which raise the potential reputational problem. Hey, you're investing in oil and gas to fund the forest. You can imagine what that storyline was like. We did this analysis of the $18 trillion pipeline, and that's actually reassured the structures that there's plenty of sustainable bonds to come through. So I'm hopeful, nothing certain yet, I'm hopeful that the fund will also become 100 billion or possibly 50 billion if the current level of input commitments come through, which will be a major investor in sustainable debt around the world. In other words, another big buyer, which will further fuel the market. So it'll have two roles. It'll grow the sustainable bond market into demand, and it will have a coupon contribution towards forest protection. So look, that a very interesting idea. There are a few interesting ideas in different ways floating around that. They've all got a bit of development to go through, but it gives you a sense of the kinds of interesting thinking that's going on about how we can bridge this divide between the challenges of investing in nature protection, biodiversity, and capital markets. And I expect we're going to see more proposals coming through going forward. Just to give you one flavour, the Conservation International has been talking about the extent to which tropical forests are ringed by logging concessions that are marginal. They don't make a lot of money. They're very tight. A tiny application of carbon price would make those logging concession lands more attractive to leave as carbon farming lands going forward. So there's a project, and that's about $100 million investment, according to Conservation International. This is another area of proposals that's coming through this coming year. And I'm very hopeful we're going to see quite quick progress without the need for global multilateral agreement, which is a very difficult thing to do. Coalitions are willing of the answer in these areas. I mean, goodness knows there's a lot to do in nature, right? We have kind of messed it up rather badly, but there are some green shoots, dare I say it, Mike?
Okay, I'm going to move on from that terrible dad joke there. Thanks, Sean. All right. Stuart, I've got one here for you. What progress was made around the loss and damage fund, and what opportunities were discussed for the Pacific? I'm particularly interested in this, given that there will be this Pacific component to the next COP, of course.
Yeah, look, to be honest, I haven't got exactly the details on the loss and damage fund because I wasn't specifically involved in those negotiations. So I can't give you all the details off the top of my head. I
think we may just have lost Stu. There you go. That's what happens when you talk outside your brief. You see, and in fact, they just take you off the air. He'll be back in a second. I think that's a technical problem. I'm going to just move across to you, Belinda. We've got a question here. Whether there were any examples that stood out for you at COP of the actions being taken by businesses, especially any that we in New Zealand could learn from, or that might impact us via supply chains.
Yeah, there were lots of things being discussed by different businesses, and it's quite sectoral in some cases. So, for example, there was a speaker from the National Grid in the UK talking about the work that they're doing to reduce losses and make it much more efficient to be distributing electricity. And there was a couple of different pulp and paper companies in South America and in Asia talking about the things that they're doing. And that was quite interesting because it was around really making the environmental changes that are being seen on the ground understandable and understood by boards. So making that connection to, we are seeing that the trees are growing differently to what they have done in the past. They're not growing as efficiently as they used to. That is related to the climate change that we're seeing. Therefore, there's benefit to us in climate change action that might reduce that direct impact on the ground to us. So creating those really clear and visible connections was one thing that was a bit of a theme across a few presentations. And then another one was around sort of incentives or disincentives for businesses within supply chains. So companies like McDonald's, like Tetra Pak, big international companies talking about how they are working in their supply chains to make sure that they're getting good information, that both on the actual emissions, but also on the adaptation and risk side of things, so that they can make the right decisions, make good decisions that reduce risk to the business. So I think probably that connecting risk with climate at board level is probably a good theme for us to be thinking about in New Zealand.
Thanks, Belinda. Hey, I'm just aware of time, so I'm just going to finish with one final question, and then we'll move to wrap up. A question here, was the link between climate change, i.e. the UNCCC, and biodiversity loss discussed at the conference? Maybe that's one for you, Belinda.
Yeah, there was a heap of conversation about biodiversity and climate, and as we've talked about a little bit, how those two are inextricably linked. We do have separate biodiversity COP and climate COP still. There wasn't a lot of talk about, do we combine those, which there has been in the past, I guess. But yes, there was absolutely plenty of conversation around, linking biodiversity and climate, both from a risk and an opportunity perspective.
Thanks, Belinda. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I just want to first of all start by thanking everyone for joining us today at today's session, and I'm sorry that we weren't able to get through all of your questions. We will pass those on to the panel though, and they may be able to get back to you on some of them. There's some excellent questions still remaining. We'll also be sharing a recording of the webinar, so please do share this with anyone who you thought might be interested in learning a bit more about it. A big thank you to Joe Kelly and the Centre for Sustainable Finance in helping bringing this session together to unpack these insights, and to all of the work that they've done in the background in promoting this. We had well over 190 people on this call today, so thank you to the Centre for Sustainable Finance, and a special thank you to Stuart, to Sean, and to Belinda for taking the time to share your insights from on the ground today. It makes a huge difference to hear directly from the people who were there. So a massive thank you to you all. And I'm going to give you 1 minute back, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.